In the rise, decline and surprising rebirth of Docker, this influential startup owns Amazon and Xiaomi. Docker was once the hottest developer startup in Silicon Valley, and DockerCon was its crown jewel, attracting thousands of attendees each year since 2014. DockerCon was the de facto conference for software containers, the nerdy but influential cloud technology that had become synonymous with Docker's brand. In those early years, companies like Google, Amazon, Microsoft, and IBM lined up to drop big demos and announcements at the show, and developers keen on a new era of cloud swarmed to soak up the energy. Docker, based in San Francisco, launched in 2013 and shot into the spotlight for its pioneering approach to containers, which allow developers to package applications to run across any cloud or hardware. While Docker didn't invent containers, it made them much easier for developers to use, starting a movement in the cloud industry that continues today. James Governor, a Redmond K analyst, described it as one of the most explosively growing technologies. The hype around Docker was, for a time, very real. It raised over $270 million from top-tier investors like Greylock Partners, Insight Partners, and Sequoia Capital, hitting its peak valuation of $1.32 billion in 2018. Its rapid growth also attracted the attention of the giants. Docker is said to have turned down a $4 billion acquisition offer from Microsoft in 2016. But while the container market soared, Docker would soon fall back down to earth. The advent of Kubernetes as a free, open-source container management tool invented at Google that leapfrogged much of Docker's own offering put massive pressure on a startup that it couldn't address. Docker cycled through 5 CEOs in less than 7 years trying to find a path back. And in 2019 it sold off its enterprise business to Mirantis, a lesser-known consulting firm, splitting the company. What was left of Docker raised a $35 million Series A round, essentially restructuring itself as a brand-new startup. To go from $1 billion unicorn and turn down an acquisition offer from Microsoft, to completely cratering and having to reboot the entire company, it's an amazing fall from grace story, a former employee told Insider. Today, Docker focuses on automation tools for developers, and it recently announced it had crossed $50 million in annual recurring revenue. Docker declined to comment for this story beyond noting that over 80,000 people attended the virtual DockerCon events hosted by the company over the past 2 years, as the pandemic led to the cancellation of the in-person event. To look back on the company's impact and what it was like to work there, Insider spoke with 10 former Docker employees as well as analysts and technology executives. The former employees asked not to be named so that they could speak candidly, but their identities are known to Insider. They described Docker as a missed opportunity and expressed disappointment that the company wasn't able to turn its rocket ship of technology into success. But as an open-source software startup caught between turning a profit and serving the open-source community, it was never going to be simple. The story of Docker starts in Paris with a startup called DotCloud, founded by Solomon Hykes, Kamal Founati, and Sebastien Pahl in 2008 to provide cloud hosting services for software developers. Over the next few years, Hykes led the development of a container-based tool to help DotCloud speed up and scale out its operations. In 2013, Hykes debuted that tool as Docker, releasing it as open source for anybody to download, use, and modify. That year, DotCloud brought in Ben Golub, a veteran of Red Hat's G-Luster storage software businesses, to serve as its CEO, with Hykes transitioning to Chief Technology Officer. One of Golub's first moves was announcing that DotCloud would rebrand as Docker Inc. The move excited investors. Cloud platforms like Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure weren't yet juggernauts, but they were clearly growing quickly. Docker's technology promised to help developers make full use of those platforms, which in turn helped it close 2013 with a new funding round at a $100 million valuation. Employees say it quickly became clear that its new position of power came with its own responsibilities, specifically the burden of translating the success of Docker, the free open-source software, into revenue for Docker Inc., the newly rechristened startup. Former employees praised Hykes as an idealist and a champion of open-source attributes that helped Docker attract and retain top-tier engineering talent but proved to be something of a double-edged sword. Open source is what hyped up Docker in the first place and caused it to spread like wildfire among developers. but the company never had a solid plan for how to make money off that software. Former employees said, "I'm not sure that Solomon even wanted to make money," said one former employee who worked under Hykes while he was the CTO. "No one was really focused on how X, Y, Z was going to lead to a longer runway of cash." Former employees say Hykes was largely uninterested in prioritizing the mundane features that paying business customers might want, including role-based access control and better user authentication. Instead, they say, he was more interested in the opinions of the open-source community that had sprung up around Docker. One former employee recalled an incident where a group of Docker salespeople confronted Hykes to tell him how important those missing features were for paying customers. Docker was overly fixated on what Hacker News said rather than what customers thought. Another former employee said, "When Golub joined Docker as CEO, he gave me one assignment: keep the open-source community growing," Hykes told Insider in a statement. "So that's what I did. My staff was approximately 5 people. I think we did a good job. Docker hired hundreds of engineers and product managers, but they didn't work for me. Sometimes people would complain to me about our product priorities, not realizing that I had no control over them. I never understood why." Golub declined to comment. Docker's most significant challenge, and employees say, its biggest missed opportunity came early. Well before the rise of Docker, Google employed Borg, a homegrown software container variant technology, to manage its own massive data centers. As containers became more popular in the industry, Google in 2014 introduced an open-source software project based on Borg called Kubernetes. With Google's backing and its reputation for working well even at especially large scales, Kubernetes was a hit out of the gate. That presented a problem for Docker, whose plans for generating revenue largely hinged on a premium product for enterprises called Swarm. Both Kubernetes and Swarm promised to help users manage their containers. But Google's software was free and reliable, and it quickly became the tool of choice. Docker suddenly looked less like a trendsetter and more like a follower. Insider said, "Kubernetes sucked all the air out of the room." A former Docker employee said, "Our customers started to ask about it, and it started to be the cool new toy that everyone wanted to play with. An open-source project largely developed by volunteers. Kubernetes doesn't belong to any one company. Google donated it to the Independent Cloud Native Computing Foundation, and any company from smaller players to giants like Amazon Web Services or Microsoft can use it as they see fit. It never expected to turn a profit." Docker had the chance to be a part of the Kubernetes movement. Craig McLuckie, a Kubernetes co-founder, told InfoWorld last year that Google had been in talks to donate the entire project to Docker for the startup to manage. But former employees say that rather than embracing Kubernetes and integrating it with Docker's own products, Docker's leadership positioned Swarm as a competitor, pitting the two against each other for users. A few years later, under a new CEO, Docker would change tactics and launch Kubernetes integrations. But as one former employee who worked on Docker's enterprise products put it, that initial hesitation was the company's original sin. By 2017, Kubernetes had only gotten more popular, with AWS, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud introducing support for the technology amid the heightened demand. Docker, meanwhile, struggled to find its niche as it missed sales targets. That year Docker brought in a new CEO, Steve Singh, an experienced tech exec best known for founding Concur in 1993 and leading it through its acquisition by SAP in 2014. He was charged with doubling down on the enterprise product and getting the business back on track. Singh's arrival came with a palpable shift in the company's culture. A former employee said, "The new CEO brought in execs from companies like SAP, Microsoft, and VMware to spearhead his strategy and change the company's beloved logo, a cartoon whale on a pile of shipping containers, to be more corporate looking." Another former employee said, praised by former employees as passionate and a great leader, Singh pushed for transparency and inclusivity. Insiders say, under his leadership, the company took steps to prioritize diversity in hiring and pushed to drop terms like master or slave in its open-source software. Under Singh, the former employees say, Docker picked up some traction with customers. In October 2018, it raised a $92 million Series E funding round at a $1.32 billion valuation, its last private fundraising before it split. Still, Docker struggled to hit its sales and revenue targets. In early 2018, Hykes decided to step away. "We need a CTO by Steve's side with decades of experience shipping and supporting software for the largest corporations in the world," he said. In 2019, things came to a head. That February, he laid off employees as part of a stated goal to hit cash flow positive. A few months later, Singh announced that its new Docker Enterprise 3.0 would include Kubernetes support, in what the CEO characterized as a move to appeal to those crucial larger customers. "We're not building the company for an exit," Singh told Insider in May 2019. "We're building the company to have a great long-term business and be sustainable." Those moves caused many to question the company's strategy, the former employees say. Still, there was some faith that Singh could lead Docker over the hurdle, especially given everything he had accomplished so far, which was why it came as a shock internally when, in June 2019, Docker announced that Singh would be leaving the company after just over 2 years as the CEO. "We thought everything was kind of going okay," a former employee said. "We had been building it out and making the product good and better." Singh was out, replaced by Rob Bearden as the CEO of the open-source big data company Hortonworks. Bearden oversaw its sale to Cloudera, a former rival. Employees noticed that Bearden had brought many of his former lieutenants from Hortonworks with him to Docker, and that he was always in meetings. They quickly came to believe that Bearden had been brought in specifically to sell Docker. In November 2019, just a few months into Bearden's tenure, Docker announced it would sell its enterprise business to Identities, a cloud consulting firm. What remained of Docker would refocus its efforts on its products for software developers, under the leadership of Scott Johnston, who had been the chief product officer before the split. Docker and Identities had a long-standing partnership and a similar view of the future of Kubernetes, making Docker an attractive acquisition target. Identities CEO Adrian Ioniel told Insider in a recent interview. The news was poorly received. The former employees say those at the company had come to terms with the fact that Docker was likely for sale, but they expected the buyer to be a household name like Amazon or Microsoft. And many were shocked and disappointed that Docker would sell to a relatively small, unknown firm like Identities. It was seen as an anticlimactic end to what they had thought would be a significant chapter in the history of cloud computing. "When I started, I was like, this will be a big deal. People are going to write books about this," one former employee said of their time at Docker. Identities wasn't that. Within weeks of the acquisition, Identities laid off several Docker employees. Ioniel said it was completely unavoidable in order to make the company more long-term and viable. Many of those who survived the cuts left of their own volition not long after, as the company saw high turnover. The former employees said many waited for their retention bonuses to kick in and then scrambled as fast as possible. One former employee said Bearden himself left shortly after the sale, and in early 2020 he returned to Cloudera as its CEO. Identities says more than 50% of former Docker employees who arrived via the acquisition remain at the company, including the chief technology officer, Adam Paku. The company told Insider it hasn't done any more layoffs and has since expanded. Under its new ownership, Docker's culture underwent yet another shift. Docker had prided itself on a strong engineering culture and classic Silicon Valley perks like free snacks, catered lunches, and the occasional lavish holiday party. Identities, meanwhile, is more buttoned up and frugal and proud of it. Food became a rarity, not the norm, as Identities leadership hammered home the need for Docker to control costs. "We're not a place that places a lot of value in ski trips, parties, meetings in 5-star hotels," Ioniel told Insider. "We are a company that prides itself on creating value, building amazing products, and working hard at building something for the long term." The sale also cinched the fall of DockerCon, which employees had seen as an important investment and part of the company's DNA. Ioniel said Identities didn't see the time and expense associated with the event as a strategic fit and decided not to be involved going forward. "They laughed us out of the room when they saw how much time we were spending at DockerCon," a former employee who landed at Identities said. Bearden declined to comment. There are reasons to be optimistic about the next chapter for both Identities and the newly restructured Docker. Former employees described Johnston as the right CEO to lead the smaller, humbler Docker through this moment, calling him open, available, and great at managing people. Singh, the former CEO, says he's a huge fan of the modern iteration of Docker and of Johnston's leadership. The enterprise version that was folded into mere entities is doing very well, as is the core developer tools business that Scott runs at Docker. Singh said, Mere Entities says 2021 was its best year ever, crediting much of its success to the Docker acquisition. A spokesperson said that nearly 300 legacy Docker enterprise customers grew their business with the company by more than $10 million last year alone. And while the story of Docker didn't end as many along the way had hoped, there's no denying it started a movement in the industry that continues today. Steve Watt, Red Hat's head of the Office of the CTO, said Docker's core technology ushered in a whole new era in cloud. And while Docker didn't go public or get scooped up by a tech titan as employees anticipated, it helped open the door for others like HashiCorp and GitLab to IPO as open source companies. Many former employees say they still look back fondly on their time with Docker, variously describing the company as a tight-knit family, friendly, the best place I ever work, the most open company, and very collaborative. But many in the industry see Docker as a cautionary tale, highlighting a perennial challenge for open-source startups. You want to have a product to succeed, Lee Sue Starr, a principal analyst at Forrester, told Insider. At the same time, you want to be part of the open-source community and energize that ecosystem, but thrive in a commercial sense. Getting that dynamic correct is something a lot of startups want to navigate.